Okay, so welcome to Beer Class, the Apocalypse Edition. What we're going to do is take a little walk around and kind of replicate what I would be doing for the walking tour that we were supposed to start. Walking tour that we were supposed to start here at Washington Platform. Washington Platform is a bar that I've talked a little bit about in Beer Class in the past. This is a Cincinnati institution. This place opened up as a bar in 1860. It has not been in continuous operation since then, but it was reopened with the original name in 1986. When you come here and you eat here, which I recommend, I also recommend you come here for happy hour beers, because craft beers during happy hour are a killer deal. When you come down here and you eat and you check out the menu, what you see is that there are some call outs in this place to New Orleans. And that is not just a choice of the restaurant. It is a choice of this restaurant that also reflects some of the history of this city. Cincinnati traditionally had a real connection to New Orleans. In the mid-1800s, there are really two significant cities anywhere west of the Appalachians, and that is the city of Cincinnati and the city of New Orleans. And those two places impacted each other in a number of ways. They impacted each other in ways that were both physical and social. When you go down to New Orleans, you go through the French Quarter, something that I don't recommend right now because there's a pandemic on. But if you go down and do that, you're going to see that a lot of the architecture down there is characterized by this wrought iron that really kind of defines what that area looks like. Almost all of that wrought iron was originally manufactured here in Greater Cincinnati, Covington specifically. So we made New Orleans look like New Orleans. In turn, New Orleans gave us a lot in terms of food and culture. Mardi Gras used to be a pretty big thing here in Cincinnati in the 1800s. Also, the #1 most popular bar food in the 1800s was oysters on the half shell. And when Washington Platform started doing oysters here in Cincinnati in 1986, they were the very first place in the city that you could get fresh oysters. It's not a big deal now, but it was in this city in the 1980s. So take a little look around of where we're at, City Hall over there. And then we'll take a quick look at this building right here across the street from Washington Platform. This building, you will notice if you have eyes, is a pretty hideous building. But what you will not know, unless I tell you, is that this is actually a 19th century building. This was the Schaller-Gurke Brewery. So I've discussed in class previously that Washington Platform was a tied house. It was a place that was connected to a brewery, specifically Schaller-Gurke. And that was it. That was not only the footprint of it, that is the building. Unfortunately, that beautiful 19th century building was modified to look like this sometime in the 1980s. So if you walk into it, you see 19th century brick. From the outside, it just looks like somebody's bad, coked up 1980s idea. Right now, we are looking at Central Parkway. That's what it is today, a 4-lane road. But what it was originally was a canal. So about where these trees go down the median of Central Parkway and the closest 2 lanes in Central Parkway, all of that was the Miami and Erie Canal. I've showed pictures of that in class. The canal went from the Great Lakes around about Toledo area, following a path that went down roughly I-75 today into what's north side in Cincinnati. And then it followed this route that is now Central Parkway. So in the 1800s, as you were making this walk that we're making right now, we would actually right now be going over top of a bridge that crossed this canal. When this canal was completed in 1828, everything on this side of the canal was still predominantly vacant land. So when we started getting these large waves of German immigrants coming to the city in the 1830s, 1840s, they started moving predominantly into this area north of the canal that was still pretty much vacant. Now that did several things. Number one, it made this area grow really quickly. By the time you get into the mid-1800s, Over-the-Rhine was the second most populated neighborhood anywhere in the United States. The other thing that it did was create America's most German per capita neighborhood. That canal got nicknamed the Rhine for the Rhine River in Germany, and that little trip we just made in the 1800s over a bridge was called going over the Rhine. It was originally kind of an action phrase. It's something you did. You went over the Rhine. And you went over the Rhine into what was originally called the German Quarter. But over time, that name, Over the Rhine, just morphed into the name of the neighborhood, and it is what the place got to be called. So we are now in Over the Rhine, and we're going to walk into Washington Park and talk a little bit about that. As we go, we're going to check out a few things around us. Take a little minute, soak in the Rhine, because it's good stuff. So Washington Park, we are entering right now, and that was the city's first formal park. This is city's first formal park. It was dedicated in 1855. This park was formed from two different cemeteries. Made it out of cemeteries because it is obviously a lot easier to move dead people than it is to move live people. So theoretically, they dug everybody up and they created this cemetery. And I say theoretically dug everybody up because what we know today is that is not entirely what happened. And when they rehabbed this park a number of years ago and they dug up this area in the northern portion of it, they had to have archaeologists on site just in case they ran into any human remains. As it turned out, they ran into quite a few of them. And some of those remains tell us a few things about life in Cincinnati beyond just the fact that they were dead bodies. One of the things that they learned from the remains that they found in this park was they found two people that were buried together. And when they found that, they were curious about why it would have occurred. So these bodies were actually sent off to a university that did carbon dating on them and tried to pinpoint when they died and who they were. The conclusion was that these two people were in their early 20s, they were probably man and wife, and they had almost certainly died during one of the cholera epidemics that came through town. So cholera was a common thing in the 1800s, and it has basically exaggerated flu-like symptoms, but it is quite deadly. That may sound vaguely familiar right now. So when cholera came through, it had a tendency though to kill many people very rapidly. That was in large part because we did not understand what it came from. You get cholera from polluted water. But at the time, people in the 1800s thought that you got cholera from airborne miasmas, from these poisons that were in the air. That wasn't the case, and as a result of believing the wrong causes, what you wound up doing was taking all of the wrong precautions to prevent it. Actually, you can spread it sometimes by some of the things they did. Now, because we didn't understand it, people did not exactly understand that drinking beer could prevent you from getting cholera. However, what they did understand is that beer is good for you. So they would drink more beer during cholera epidemics. Sometimes, particularly in brewery, employees would drink nothing but beer. As a result of that, beer did save your life during cholera epidemics. Beer is not going to save your life during the current pandemic, but it is probably going to make it more enjoyable. When we walk over here, what we're going to see is 3 tombstones that actually have been in this park and were buried in this park. ever since it was converted to a park in 1855. So all three of these tombstones were dug up and they sit here today. They are the base of tombstones, actually. They're incredibly readable for being as old as they are and having been buried here. You know, this one, for example, is 1833. All of them come from roughly the 1830s. So really old, and we're here all of that time. Here's some dogs. Usually as I am giving a walking tour, I notice that people are looking at the dogs because they find them much more interesting than me. So I'm going to show you some dogs. There are some dogs. Look, dogs. I'm also, because I'm walking around, you know, with the camera strapped to my head, talking to myself like a freak, I'll point out a few other things. This is a boulder. Now, you may say, so what? And you would be correct to say, so what? Because what this is a rock. It is just a rock. However, it is part of Cincinnati legend. For a long time, people believed that that boulder was an asteroid, that it was something that had crashed to Earth here. And parents told children that, and children grew up and told their kids that, and people believed it up until very recently, when it was finally conclusively proven that that was not any great asteroid fallen to Earth, but was in fact just a rock. This new outside bar over here in Washington Park. It's been here, I think it opened about a year ago. These guys have good beers, and it is a fantastic place to come and have a beverage on a beautiful day like this, except of course they are not open. That's Music Hall. Music Hall was completed in roughly a year when it was built originally. So Washington Park, when I first started working in Over-the-Rhine a number of years ago, Over-the-Rhine was still Over-the-Rhine old school. So when you came into this park, I came into this park with a camera once, and I was threatened to be shot for being in this park with the camera. So it's very different from now when you see hipsters doing yoga and things of that nature. As we go, as we get a little bit farther, we're going to talk a bit more about the architecture in this neighborhood, and I'm going to pan around a few times to try to capture some of that, try to reflect some of what is here. I have never walked around a neighborhood with a camera strapped to my head, so really how this is going to come out, what it's going to look like, and how cheesy it's going to be is anybody's guess. What I can absolutely guarantee you is that it is not going to win any awards, and there is some slight possibility that it's going to get my ass kicked. You can see right down there, Taft Brewery. If you guys haven't been to Taft, you should check it out. They're making some good beers. They got some decent food. That is also the second oldest church in the city of Cincinnati, oldest church building. Beer, somewhat of a religion, but a little bit different. So that church was St. Paul's, and it was in really bad shape before Taft came in and rehabbed it. They did over $10 million worth of renovation on that property. So it is beautiful space inside. Now what we're looking at right now is the corner of Republic and what I think by memory is 14th Street, maybe 13th. But at any route, what you're going to notice here is, although they are closed because there's a plague on, you see bars on two of these corners. This one right here actually being one of my real favorite bars here and Over-the-Rhine. But you got a bar on this corner, you got a bar on this corner. Here you have a little grocery that was originally would have been a bar, and this newer building over here would have probably also originally been a bar. And that's because this street really here in the heart of the neighborhood, you know, these corner locations were really coveted as bars because they were easier to see. So these locations, when you're walking through Over-the-Rhine and you're seeing a corner storefront that looks like this, it is almost certain that that location was originally one of the roughly 300 bars that you found in this neighborhood. So we're now on Vine Street. As we have discussed, Vine Street was the real epicenter of drunkenness in this city, in a city that was pretty drunk all across itself. But Vine Street was the real artery, real kind of entertainment artery. It's also still one of the most beautiful streets that you find in this city. Now this location of this beautiful architecture, the Mercer Building, is not an example. It is, however, an example of a location that was significant to the history of this neighborhood. So this neighborhood, as I mentioned a minute ago, had become the single most German per capita neighborhood anywhere in the United States. Now, what happens from a political standpoint in this country is that in the 1840s, you had two political parties, the Republicans, or the Democrats rather, and the Whigs. The Republican Party did not exist yet. The Whig Party kind of collapsed under its own stupidity, and that created a political vacuum. That political vacuum got filled with a movement that became known as the Know Nothing movement. It's not called that because they didn't know anything, although that would be largely apt. It's called that because it originally came out of secret societies, and people would deny that they knew anything about these activities. But eventually, this political movement, it became a major political movement, went under several different names. The American Party was the largest one of them. Now, what this all meant from a political belief system changed a little bit over time, but by the time you got into the mid-1850s, the Know Nothing movement was largely focused on being anti-immigrant, being a nativist group. They were very concerned about how all of these foreigners that were coming to America, meaning predominantly the Irish and the Germans, were threatening good, solid American values. So here in the city of Cincinnati in 1848, there was a change in the political system. 1848, the city annexed a huge amount of real estate north of Liberty Street, which was the original boundary of the city. When it did that, it added thousands and thousands and thousands of German Americans to the voter rolls here in the city of Cincinnati. So that was going to change the political dynamic in this city. I'm going to pause for a second because this appears to be I have a loud vehicle and I want to drive it day here in the hood. So this starts to change the political dynamic. And in the election, municipal election, it's going to be held in 1855. The know-nothings are very afraid that there is going to be a shift in power and that the Democrats are going to take over and that the Germans and the Irish are going to have significant political power in this city. So what they do as a result is send people out to protect against voter irregularities. That was the cover story. Now, voter fraud was in fact an actual thing back then, but what this was really about was going to the polls and beating the hell out of the Germans and the Irish to try to dissuade them from voting. This led to active violence. A bunch of know-nothings came into Over-the-Rhine. They went up to McMicken and they stabbed a brewer to death in front of a brewery called the F&J A-Link Brewery. That then led to further fighting, and there was 3 days of rioting that went on here in Cincinnati. At kind of the peak of it, know-nothings came up Vine Street, they came over the Rhine, and they came marching straight up Vine Street here. Now what had happened is that the neighborhood had really kind of closed itself off, shut up shops, sent women and children home, and they brought most of their guns and arms to a building called Freethinkers Hall that used to sit on this site where the Mercer is today. So the know-nothings decided they're going to come up here, they're going to attack this hall, and they're going to put an end to this. You know, they are going to put down the Germans here in Over-the-Rhine, who of course are actually American citizens. But what happens instead is they come up Vine Street, all marching in military fashion, all heavily armed. They get right about here across the street. They pull out their guns, but the people of this neighborhood had been waiting for them. So the people of this neighborhood emerge from over top of these rooftops. They aim their guns down and they start shooting into that crowd that has come here to attack the neighborhood. So a couple people get shot. Everybody that can starts running as quickly as they can back over across the Rhine. Let's walk this way. So as a result of that, it was kind of a decisive battle in this fight for Over-the-Rhine and for the soul of this city. What happened is that in 1855, there was then a shift in power. Democrats did take over control of the city, and it had a profound impact on the political dynamics of this city for the next couple of decades. This building across the street, this stone facade building that you see right here, this is 1313 Vine Street. It has a very colorful history to it, including the fact that before they built this much larger, much nicer structure on top of it in the 1890s, it was actually an 1850s brewery. So this building has huge lagering cellars underneath of it. And it is my understanding that those lagering cellars are about to become the first to be turned into an active bar, the first lagering cellars in the city to become an active bar. It's also just a fantastic building. It's been in a couple of movies, and it's got this spring-loaded dance floor on the upper floors of it. This building that has the Venice sign on it, that was originally the People's Theater. It had this cupola that was there on the end of it. People's Theater did really just kind of sort of lowbrow, working class theater. That was kind of its thing. This building across the street belonged to the Lackman family. Lackmans were big brewers, very successful brewers, and you can still see the Lackman logo go in the tile over there. When you walk through this neighborhood, you can still see a lot of evidence of its Germanness in what's written on a lot of the buildings. That is primarily the churches, because things are actually carved into stone with the churches. But you can also see some of these signs that survived. This one was covered up for a long time. And so when they rehabbed this building a few years ago, turned it into a bar, they restored the original sign that was on this building. And I would love to tell you what it says, but I have no idea, other than that it is in German. So right now we're coming up to Old St. Mary's. Old St. Mary's is Cincinnati's oldest standing church. It was completed, date on the front of it says 1841. It was completed and they actually started using it in 1842. When they built this building, this neighborhood, this city, was going through such a building boom that it was hard to get basic materials. So parishioners of this church, the congregation existed before the church itself. Parishioners would bake bricks at home and bring them with them to services on Sunday. So a lot of the bricks that were used to construct this church were actually made by the parishioners of this church. Now when you look up at the top of this church, you're looking up at a steeple that is 177 feet tall. The way they built that steeple originally was there was a huge, really ancient tree beside it. And that's the only way they were able to build that high. When it was completed, this was the first public clock tower in the city. It was also the tallest building in the city. So anywhere you were in what constituted the city of Cincinnati, you could see the tower of Old St. Mary's and you could see that clock. Now, in addition to being the city's oldest church, this church does some things that I think are pretty cool. For one, it is the only church in the United States that has done Mass in German every Sunday since 1842. It's no longer their primary Mass. They still do German Mass every Sunday. After German Mass every Sunday, they do something that I think is cooler, which is they go to their bar. This church has a Rathskeller, and so it's kind of common practice that after German Mass, they go into the Rathskeller, which is in the basement of this building over here, right behind the pregnancy center. and you can fill in your commentary to that one as you see fit. So Cincinnati is said to have the largest collection of Italianate architecture, at least per capita, of any neighborhood in the United States. I'm not really sure if that is objectively true or not, but I can tell you that we have a lot of it. Now, what we're going to do now, and what the ability to do walking around with a freak, like a freak with a camera on my head, that I can't do as easily when I'm walking around with a group of you people, is kind of pick and choose some of the best examples of some of the 3 basic building types that you find in this neighborhood. The first and the oldest is this one across the street. This building is a good example of muted Greek revival or vernacular architecture. It was common before the Civil War here in Over-the-Rhine. What you see in these buildings is they are the most simple buildings, and you see very simple square lines. And the storefronts on a building like this, they are called muted Greek revival in part because you'll see that all of the structure of the storefront actually comes either from stone or brick, or typically a combination. So you see stone running across the top of this storefront, and it would be common with these storefronts to either have brick pillars or stone pillars. Now that changes when you get into Italianate architecture. And this building across the street, the Brown Bear Bakery building, that is a spectacular example of sort of a high-end Italianate building. What you see there are those iron columns that make up the storefronts. See the same thing in these buildings to the right of us, also great examples of Italianate architecture. Italianate becomes popular around about 1860-ish. Most of our Italianate buildings were built right after the Civil War ended, when we went through a building boom. So we replaced a lot of the older buildings with these newer Italianate structures. What you see in these buildings is a lot more ornamentation. At the top of them, over the windows, you will notice these, like the cornice work at the very top of it, juts out a lot. It's prominent, it's large, it's very decorative. You also see all of the decorative elements that you find above the windows, below the windows, sometimes in the shape of the windows themselves. You'll sometimes see asymmetric patterns in these buildings. This one across the street, you see the ironwork on that building. That's a good example of ironwork that we were making here as a city in the mid-1800s. It's type of the ironwork that we were shipping down to New Orleans to make the French Quarter the French Quarter. We're now on Main Street, which is probably the single most intact street in this city, and it is definitely my favorite street in the neighborhood. Due to the combination of gorgeous building stock, as well as the fact that Main Street has evolved a little bit differently than the rest of the neighborhood. Main Street was really kind of the first place where people started to work on revitalization of this neighborhood in the late 80s and 1990s. And so it has grown more slowly, and it has generally evolved more naturally than the rest of the neighborhood. So here again, this building across the street, this was originally a hotel, and great building, all that's copper on the outside of it. building across the street that now has Platform Brewing Company in the first floor of it, another spectacular example of Italianate architecture. Whenever you're looking at these rounded windows, that's how you know what you're looking at. I do not. Nope. Hey, how's it going? Good. I'm teaching beer class. This is Steve Hampton. Steve's executive director of the Brewery District, out walking his son, who is much bigger than the last time I've seen him. Yes. So yeah, this is virtual beer class, man. See you. So what you can also get here is another kind of transitional example of what we call vernacular or muted Greek revival architecture in this neighborhood, in this bar here called Below Zero. The third type of architecture that you find in this neighborhood is what's here at Half Cut. And this is a spectacular example of a Queen Anne building. Now, there are several things that set these Queen Anne buildings apart. They are as ornamental as what you find in the Italianate buildings, but they're the very first time that they had the technology to understand how to make brick that was meant to be exposed. So buildings like this one right behind me here, this is a great example of Italianate building, and it is unpainted, but it should not be unpainted. It's porous brick, and it's eventually going to erode. Brick in this building across the street is different. It's harder, and it was always meant to be exposed. It's also, you find that the ornamentation in it, because they have these advances in masonry techniques, they're using them. So you find things in these buildings like that keyboard pattern in the bricks. Also, you see the ornamentation in the cornices is coming from masonry work. It's stone as opposed to sheet metal, which is typically used on the Italianate cornices. Now, this building right here, we've talked about this building before. So this is the Germania building. Although almost every building in this neighborhood was designed and built by German Americans, there is not a particularly German influence to most of these buildings. Italianate architecture was really just what was in vogue at the time. This building's a little bit different in the fact that you can see elements in it that really play to a Bavarian influence. So this building has this very specific kind of German look to it, this Bavarian look to it specifically. And these letters at the top of it, we have discussed the fact that once we entered World War I, we went through this period that became known later as the anti-German hysteria. But what happens is that anything that is affiliated with Germanness is now a very negative thing. So the city winds up changing these 13 different street names from German names to more English names. It also fires all of the German teachers out of public schools, because we had previously been bilingual in all of our public schools. And a bunch of businesses like this one voluntarily changed their name. So this one went from being the German Mutual Insurance Company, which is what it says up there at the top. At least that's what I'm told, because I can't read it, But it goes from being the German Mutual Insurance Company to being the Hamilton County Mutual Insurance Company. And beyond that, they went up there and covered over those letters. It's why it looks a little bit darker behind all those letters, because they had this metal covering on them from 1918 until when it was all uncovered in 2014 for the 100-year anniversary of World War I. Point out a few more things here while I'm walking around. This is the American Building. The American Building definitely does not fall within one of those three building types you find Over the Rhine. It's on the edge of it. This is on what is today Central Parkway. When the American Building was built in the 1920s, we had planned to construct a subway system. So it has a basement that would have gone out into a subway platform. This was originally an office tower. And in addition to all of these amenities, it was set up to be used by the subway. It was also set up to be functional in terms of car parking. You know, car parking is becoming a new thing in the 1920s. So the back part of this building is actually one of the earliest parking garages in the United States. So kind of hard to get excited about parking garages, but that one's historic for a parking garage. Also, by the time you get into the 1920s, Cincinnati still has a vibrant economy. It's still a pretty significant city. So you find a lot, or at least a handful of really good examples of Art Deco architecture here in the city of Cincinnati. Union Terminal, of course, is the most famous one. 800 Broadway, which is today's divorce court, is actually my favorite. And the American Building is no slouch. You can see some great detail on this building. It's really well constructed. It has a beautiful lobby in it. So we're now back walking down Central Parkway, which would have been the canal originally. On either side of the canal was Canal Street. So right now, as soon as possible, right about now we would be walking across North Canal Street. And right about now, we would be stepping off a cliff and falling into a body of water that constituted the canal. And we would be doing that until we get over to the far side of Central Parkway, when we would be going back over South Canal Street. So this is the canal. This is really the dividing line between the older city to the right of us and Over the Rhine to the left of us. When we look over to the right, we see a great hero in this city, and a guy that I'm very proud to call a friend of mine. That is Mr. Jim Tarbell. Tarbell was a great visionary here in Cincinnati in terms of a guy that advocated very heavily for redevelopment of downtown. It's one of the earlier murals in this city. It's so well done that it takes a lot of people some time to realize that half of the windows on this building are real windows, and half of them are painted. And just recently, a friend of mine said that he was down here for an event and he saw a couple of guys, probably a little bit intoxicated, but this mural was still convincing enough to them as they got this close that they tried to go up those steps and ran straight into that wall. Liquor will do that to you. As you get farther into downtown, muted Greek Revival buildings become really rare, because you're talking about a building that was constructed prior to the Civil War, building from the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So most of those were destroyed to build, newer buildings in the 1860s at least. And then most of those buildings, of course, were destroyed to build newer buildings after that. This one on the corner here of Court and Vine is a rare example of a really fantastic pre-Civil War piece of architecture. So what we're about to do now is go into a lagering cellar. Now this lagering cellar was not underneath an actual brewery. It was a building that was owned by the Schaller-Gerke Brewery, and it was built to be used largely the way it is used today, which is with retail space on the first floor of it and apartments on the upper floors of it. But it had a very unique and important additional feature to it, and that is that the brewery stored and aged and lagered a lot of its beer here. So we're going to go into that cellar, and as we do that, you're either going to be bummed out that you're not doing this in person, or you're going to be grateful because these stairs are a little bit terrifying. So we're back beside Washington Platform. So before we go into a lagering cellar, let me say something else about the canal, which is how it went from being a canal to this 4-lane road that's here today. The canal, as we had discussed, was really critical to turning Cincinnati into the single most important trading hub anywhere in the West. But by the time you get into the late 1800s, that canal was no longer particularly useful for commerce, and it had mostly become just a big open sewer. So, Cincinnatians wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to do something more productive with it. There were a lot of people that tried to get control of it for a rail line, for a private rail line. But Cincinnatians then, by the early 1900s, about 1912 roughly, they start serious conversations about building a very ambitious rail system. So the idea was to construct a subway in this city. And this subway would have not only connected a bunch of downtown and neighborhoods, but it also would have been connected to a larger commuter rail system that would have gone around about the path of what is I-275 today. So this is a very ambitious plan, and Cincinnatians really start to get behind it by 1914. By 1916, they approve this very ambitious rail system that absolutely would have transformed this city. They approved it by a 6-to-1 margin, so it was very popular when they passed it into law. The problem with this was that then World War I started for Americans. World War I started in 1914. We were out of it until we entered the war in 1917. So when we entered the war, they had to halt construction, or they had to halt plans for construction for the subway. It meant that it did not get started until after we got out of the war. So in 1920, they started dredging the canal, draining it, and they started converting this canal into a subway tunnel. So they built that, and what we have is a subway tunnel that runs from roughly Jack Casino all the way down Central Parkway through the city into the neighborhood of North Side. A bunch of subway tunnel, and it has never ever been used. Reason was when they started construction, the cost of raw materials had roughly doubled as a result of the war, so they didn't have enough money to finish it. The subway then started to lose political favor with certain people. There was some change in politics in the city in the 1920s, and there was a faction that thought that building rail was silly because the future was in cars and surface parking lots like this one. So the subway system and the rail system was deprioritized. A handful of politicians successfully managed to shut it down, and it was never used, which is tragic for a lot of reasons. One, because it would have definitely transformed this city, and Cincinnati would probably be larger and more relevant today as a result. The second is it was a massive amount of wasted money. Cincinnatians did not pay off the bond debt that was incurred to build and then tear down a bunch of rail system until the 1960s. So we're back in the alley, where all kinds of good things can happen. And all of this, as far as you know, is legal. So we're going to head down into a lagering cellar. This is all mostly safe, but as you can see, this is just the back of a retail space, and these cellars, have been here all these years. Some of these cellars get lost, this one and then rediscovered. This one was never actually lost, but the building was in ownership of one family for a very long period of time, and they just didn't care. Now this originally, I believe that this back shaft of this lagering cellar was used to maintain ice. So they would have filled this thing up with ice early in the winter, and they would have used that ice throughout the year. Then later they carved a part of it out, a hole in it, to make this elevator shaft. So this was one of the very early forms of elevators, somewhere in the early 1900s. When I first came in here, that elevator was still hanging here, and we had to cut it out to put in these scaffolding stairs, which was a pretty dangerous thing. Fortunately, I knew a guy from a bar, which is where you find people who are willing to do that type of work cheaply. So we're headed down a set of scaffolding steps. You can see from these that this does go straight down. You can see that, which is why it scares the hell out of a lot of people. And actually, I'd like to be all manly about it and tell you that I was always cool with it. But the truth is, the first time I came down these steps, I needed to drink a couple beers first. So we're headed on down. You can see the level of depth that we're going. We're going roughly 4 stories below ground. You can also see most people miss this when they walk down these steps the first time because the steps scare them. So we'll notice here that there is a level above the level that we're gonna go into. This would have probably either been used for additional beer storage, or it might have been used for raw ingredient storage. So we are now in a lagering cellar. And this cellar, again, we're about 40 feet deep. What you can see in this cellar is that this cellar looks pretty much like every other lagering cellar. At least all the lagering cellars built in the city up in the 1890s. And then there was a slight change in the design of them. But they're all basically the same design. They are stone arched. And what you see in them, there are several features of these cellars that all stay the same. One of them is these things on the side of the cellar that look like fireplaces. So those things are actually ventilation shafts. And when you're fermenting beer in these spaces, and nobody would have fermented in this one, but typical lagering cellars, they're doing both fermenting and aging and lagering. When you are fermenting a beer, it is giving off CO2, and that will make the air in an environment like this poisonous very quickly. So these ventilation shafts were necessary. These holes at the top were about temperature regulation. This thing over here would have been the dumbwaiter, where they brought beers down. So they would have brought, kegs, big wooden kegs of beer down through this elevator, 4 stories from the top, and then they would have loaded those beers up in this space, packed it in the back, packed it all in with ice, covered it over with straw and pitch, and sealed everything up. So that's how these spaces would have worked originally. And again, this one, they never made beer in it, they just stored beer in it, they aged beer in it. And as we have discussed previously, that was a long process in the 1800s. Lagering a beer would take 6 to 9 months in the 1800s. It's not like making a lager beer today. So breweries that were making any level of, that had any level of major production, they needed a lot of additional space so that they could lager their beers. So that's what a lagering cellar looks like. This one, most of them, as I said, look pretty much the same, but some of the bigger ones, have multiple sections to them. So this is just one single tunnel. We are also going to go up to the Jackson Brewery. By we, I mean me, you virtually out there in the virtual world. We're going to go into the Jackson cellar, and up there you'll see the same basic construction, but you'll see that it is much larger on the scale of a bigger brewery that was using its lagering cellars for purposes of brewing and lagering. So lagering in the 1800s taking a very long time, and if you're a big brewery, you need to places to store beer, which is why they had these buildings that were just apartment buildings, but you could store beer in. Christian Moorline, for example, at their peak, they would have about 65,000 barrels of beer storing, just aging at any given moment in time. Now, the original way that you got down into this space was right here, and there was a metal ladder that went from up there down here, about a 40-foot ladder. The very first time I came down into this space, I had to use that ladder to come down, and it eventually broke on somebody. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but it was pretty scary. So you came down there with a metal ladder, and when you got down here, these lights were not here, and it was pitch black. So I have been one of the earlier people in several of these tunnels, and that's a really fun thing to do. One of the things that I used to tell people about these tunnels is that, you know, there is nothing alive down here. You do not need to be afraid of running into anything, you know, that's going to bite you, because there's no sources of food and there's nothing alive and there are no rats or anything like that down here. I used to say that with pretty much every tour so that it wasn't something that freaked people out. Then a couple of years ago, I took a tour group into this particular cellar, and it had been really wet, it was rainy, there were some weird things going on, but for whatever reason, a huge rat the size of a dog was down here. And so I'm down here giving a tour to a group of people, and this big huge rat shows itself, and it was not, you know, people took videos of it, things like that. It's really not what you're looking for in terms of marketing when you're doing tours of places like this. But now when I come down here, I always make sure that I'm not about to run into a rat. This is part of the elevator system that was here. Again, we get like a sense of just how high up this is and what the original construction of this place looked like. Now right now, if you guys have any questions, you can ask them, but the way that one-way video works is that I won't hear them. So, you know, feel free to ask whatever you want. You can say whatever insulting things you want, quite frankly, because I'm not going to hear it and I don't care. We are now going back up to the top. Do this a few times a day. It's actually a fantastic workout for your legs. So we're up at the top, we're leaving a lagering cellar. Let's head over to Washington Platform. Building over there is City Hall, by the way, one of America's best examples of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture in a public building. Beautiful building, full of a lot of dumb things going on. And this, we're back to Washington Platform, which originally constituted this building on the end. These two buildings which had a large second floor on top of all of them. So we're going to go into the platform, and I'm going to see if I can get a carry-out beer.